Good afternoon in India, and good morning here from a cooling east coast of the United States, where I currently am. Good morning from this side of the pond to the 10th webinar of the series on biodiversity conversations, India's opportunities and challenges. These webinars focus on various aspects of the national mission on biodiversity and human well-being. This webinar series is jointly organized by the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, the National Biodiversity Authority, and the Biodiversity Collaborative. My name is Pandit. I'm the Director of the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, or ATRE. The topic for today's discussion is Cataloging and Mapping Life of India, or Biodiversity Informatics in India. I'm delighted that we have a diverse and wonderful set of people who share their knowledge and experiences with us. And before I start introducing them, I have a few announcements to make for all the participants. You can always open your chat box for all the details will also be sent over there. We've received some questions by email during registration and welcome additional questions during the webinar. I would request that you use your Q&A facility to ask the questions to the panelists. Questions that are not answered during the webinar due to a shortage of time will be answered via email, and you can also get in touch with us at contact@biodiversitycollaborative.org. Questions can also be asked anonymously if that is your preference, but we encourage all of you to include your email ID while sending, because that will enable us to respond to you later in case we are not able to get to your question during the time frame of the webinar. The webinar is also being streamed live on our Facebook page, Biodiversity Collaborative, and a recording of the webinar will be uploaded soon on our YouTube channel, Biodiversity Collaborative. The channel also has recordings of previous webinars. Please note that we have updated the YouTube link as we had to resolve some technical issues earlier, so do use the link Biodiversity Collaborative when you're on the YouTube channel. I'd like to acknowledge the support that we have received from the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India for conducting these webinars. During this webinar, the chat facility will be disabled. Please try and use the raise your hand function. Just use the Q&A function so that we collect the questions appropriately at the end. So with that being said, let me start by introducing the panelists. I'll introduce them one by one before they speak. The first panelist will be Dr. R. Prabhakar. Dr. Prabhakar is with Strand Life Sciences and MetaString Foundation of the Biodiversity Collaborative. He's a fellow at MetaString Foundation and heads the Biodiversity Informatics streams, Biodiversity Portal since the inception in 2009, and is also an executive member of the Taxonomic database working groups that evolves biodiversity informatics standards in the databasing and exchange of biodiversity. An old hand at this, with that, Parker, about 15 minutes or so.
Thank you. Let me jump into my presentation. Let me just verify that the screen is well and visible. Yeah, so is my screen visible?
Not yet. Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much. I'm going to be speaking on cataloging and mapping life and the biodiversity informatics in India, give a profile of what has been happening in the field of biodiversity informatics in India. So while I focus on cataloging and mapping life, there's just a pretty picture before we get into a more complicated flow diagram. But what I wanted to say is cataloging and mapping life is viewed as a cross-cutting theme right across the national mission. The main objectives of the program are mapping biodiversity of India, to build an open access, validated, and national spatio-temporal repository of the biodiversity of India. So it has to be open access, it's completely open access to be used by everybody. It's essentially validated, so there must be some level of validation, and you will have a spatial temporal component to the biodiversity of India. The second objective is to collaborate with all programs of the mission to enable the digitization, curation, and organization of biodiversity data. So there are the biodiversity mission has seven components, and one of the things is to collaborate with each of these programs and components to database the kind of data that they will generate and put it all onto a central platform. Third and the most important objective, closely with user groups and sectors, sectors in the field, the government programs, etc., for mainstreaming biodiversity science in society. This is a very, very important aspect where we must engage with the population and the civil society of India. So like I said, there are 7 components of the national mission. There are 2 cross-cutting components. One is the cataloging, the Nisarga Bharat, or the cataloging and mapping life component. The other are the 7 components. The other common cross-cutting component is capacity building and outreach. These should go across all the different programs. And so it is kind of central that cataloging and mapping life manages to showcase digitally the activities of the whole program and provides transparency to the whole program, to Indian society, to the society at large. Now, when that happens, one has to, in the cataloging and mapping life, one has to pick up or understand the databasing and the requirements of information, the kind of information that we generated by ecosystem services, by biodiversity in agriculture, the way cultivars are being databased, the passport method of databasing cultivars, all that must be kind of understood and put into the system. Climate change, disaster risk mitigation, and all that must also be kind of a component of it, which means climate, the rainfall, the soils, the slopes, all that should come into and should be databased in the cataloging and mapping life. Biodiversity and health, the One Health program is a very, very important component. So we must get what is the kind of relevant information that the biodiversity and health program will generate as a part of this mission, and how do we kind of bring it in. Bioeconomy is an important component. What about the costs of environment versus development? What are the benefits of development? The cost-benefit analysis, those components must come in. And biodiversity and capacity and outreach will also have a place in this whole cataloging and mapping life. So it's seen as an integrating component, and there are challenges when you integrate component. So there is the CML component must integrate data from different themes, different programs of the mission, as well as aggregate data from what we find in different digital databases around the world, in India and around the world. When you want to integrate and aggregate data, which is siloed in different aspects, which is on the figure on the left-hand side, there are different silos of information. Each of it will have its own methods of collecting data and warehousing data and things like that. But if you really want to kind of integrate all that data, you must do a few things. You must do essentially 3 important things. One is you must have a significant and important and a robust data model for organizing data from these different silos that generate the data. It's very important to have a simple, intuitive, and well understood data model when you want to aggregate data from various sources, because you want all the data from various sources to talk to each other, to converse with each other and share commonalities within each other while maintaining the differences. The second important aspect of this whole thing is the idea of putting up metadata and the discovery of these data sets with based upon the metadata that we put in. So a metadata structure for all the different components that come in, for the data that comes in from different sources, is very, very important. And this metadata also would provide the traceability or the provenance of any little bit of data that your database, where does it come from, what is the method of collection of the data, who contributed the data, who owns the data, and various other aspects are very, very important when you kind of database the data in a data model. So metadata is very, very important. The last and the third thing that's very important is standards of exchange and integration of the data. You need to suck in data digitally from various platforms. You need to be having the ability to share data across various platforms, for which standards and exchange of data are very, very important. So there are three important aspects when you want to go from siloed data to big data. And if you do this efficiently, then you have big data coming in and you can do a lot of analytics and understanding and newer methods of science to do with all this data. Now, what is the data model that we have? In biodiversity information systems, we work with a very, very elegant data model, which has a taxonomy axis, a taxonomy reference axis, a spatial reference axis, and a temporal reference axis. These are the three axes on which we reference any data that comes into the system. The taxonomy axis will provide you a tree of life. What is the kind of species? Where does it have? Where does it come in the tree of life? Where is it? Is it a mammal? Is it a bird? Is it an insect? Is it a plant? Is it a fungi? So in the tree of life, where do you kind of put this little bit of information that comes in? The second aspect is the spatial axis. The spatial axis will tell you where the species occurs, what's the distribution of the species. And in fact, the spatial axis is very much of a cross-cutting axis, because you can put, for example, climates, vegetation, infrastructure development, populations, artifacts that humans make all over the place onto a spatial database. So a spatial infrastructure is in fact very, very pervasive over most of the system. The third is the temporal aspect of it, saying when, where, what occurs. And this is also very, very important, because now with climate change and things like that, the temporal axis is equally important. So you have different variables, and all these variables are axes along three different axes: the species, the time, and the location. Now, based upon this, we build what are called objects. So these objects are in some sense consolidated objects of taxonomic, spatial, and temporal reference. And these objects have an independent entity and independent existence. They can be looked at separately. And that is where the metadata element comes in. So for each object, there will be an associated metadata. Today, we have constructed an observation object, a species object, a specimen object, and a landscape object. But you can create other objects from these basic reference systems. On top of it, you have standards for exchange. Some of them are global standards. We can develop standards and evolve standards as we go along. The Darwin Core Archive, the species profile model, the standard for specimen data, and the standard for exchange of map data and map information. Now, you aggregate data from various sources. There are three major groups from where you want to aggregate data. You want to aggregate data from Earth observatory observations. These are large open databases that are there, the Google Earth Engine, the AWS, the Bhuvan program in India itself. They are large images, and then additionally, there are flight images, there are drone images. So there are a whole lot of imagery and Earth observation imagery that's available. They need to be interpreted, but they are available in one nice open access bunch. The second criteria is public data sets. And there are a whole lot of India-specific public data sets available. There are many databases in India which talk about biodiversity. In addition, there are global data sets like the GBIF, the Global Forest Change. We need to aggregate those kinds of data. And finally, the third group of data is the citizen participatory crowdsourced data, which is gaining prominence all over. And it's becoming very, very significant with the ability of technology to aggregate data from different areas in the field and put them all together in a platform. So we need to have mechanisms in which open access data from Earth Observatory, public data sets, and citizen participatory platforms are crowdsourced and data-based on one common platform. Once you have them together on a platform, you need to have the ability to explore the data, essentially a very, very simple interface to cut, slice, and dice the data, to visualize the data, to analyze the data, and to infer, plan, and manage the data. So you need to get this data and provide these tools where people can kind of look at the data and study the data in more detail, to analyze the data, to get the data that they want, and do further analysis on the data that's available to them. Now the CML components, the CML functional components, all CML data will operate under the FAIR principles, which is they'll all be findable, they'll all be open data, they'll be findable, they'll be accessible, they'll be interoperable, and they'll be reusable. So that's the principle with which this whole repository will be built. On that, we will build some functional modules which attend to specific functions like ePBR, collection management, environment and social assessments, EIAs, spatial analysis, agroforestry, biodiversity monitoring, One Health, and the bioeconomy. Now, one of the important things that we need to do is to make the data accessible to sectoral groups, like agriculture should be able to use this group, health should be able to use these groups, so different sectoral groups should be able to use it for the benefit of society, for the benefit of people, for development, and various other functions like that. Now, just 2 minutes on the biodiversity informatics scenario in India. This is a collage of the different databases and different platforms that are available in India. Now, let me just kind of detail it a little more and give you a certain narrative on what these different databases are. These are all India-specific activities on databasing biodiversity. Now, the first thing is that one must realize that Hortus malabaricus is one of the first documentations of India's biodiversity, and it was essentially done in 1869 with the help of local Vaids, local Ayurvedic physicians, local medicine men, and that's really with which they produced this fantastic document, Hortus malabaricus, which is still very, very commonly cited upon. Then you have the ZSI and the BSI that started off in 1819. Then you have the NVIS, a government program that started off, in fact, in the pre-internet days on databasing biodiversity by an NVIS program. Very, very visionary. And then it has continued right through. Further, from 2001 onwards, internet-based devices, databasing came in. There is Diversity India. A whole series of initiatives were initiated by the TDU, which is on traditional medicine. Then there was the India Nature Watch and the IBIN that started in 2006, which is essentially photographers coming and putting out data, and IBIN, which was in fact the first database on biodiversity in India. In 2007, there was the eFlora of India, which was an e-group, and there was Migrant Watch that came into the scene. In 2009, the India Biodiversity Portal came up. The I Found Butterflies came up as a very, very preliminary database of the butterflies of India, which has now expanded and grown. There was Seasons Watch, there was IBIS, these all specific databases on biodiversity. 2012 and 13, there were a whole lot of conferences that we organized where we got international people to come in and talk to us on biodiversity informatics. The first conference was held in 2012 by ATRI, and we also went on to global platforms. The IBP team went on to global platforms and talk about the presentation of biodiversity and what we were doing in India to the rest of the world. Since then, there were many other platforms. The bird count came in 2014 with eBird, and that has really blown the database that is coming out from India on the biodiversity of India to a level which is unsurpassable even today. Then, of course, the India Observatory was launched in 2018, and 2019. Today, we are with the National Biodiversity Vision and the Biodiversity Science Council. Now, this is in fact the last slide. What are the opportunities and challenges? I've stepped over my time, but let me take a minute. Now, biodiversity data is all over the world. There are global platforms that database biodiversity. But ours, the CML program, will be a unique experiment of biodiversity information specifically targeted at development. We are a densely populated area. And if we are going to kind of live and let live with biodiversity, we would need to understand how to relate to biodiversity, how to live with it, and how to foster biodiversity in development aspirations of a large population that's growing very, very tremendously. So it's going to be very, very different from what the rest of the world biodiversity information systems do. The second thing is we need to have a social, economic, and environmental informatics platform that will bring in other strains of information, not just biodiversity information, but information on culture, information on livelihoods, information on traditional knowledge, all that into a system. And then the data must be openly available so that there is transparent planning and development with a South focus. The challenges is really building partnerships and collaboration. These are very, very important. We need to build partnerships within the community. Within India, we must have a strong community that fosters biodiversity informatics and build partnerships with each other and help each other to grow this thing all over, this thing which will have some benefit and impact on society. Implementation of standards is very important, and resource and sustainability for continuing this program is also very important, because without resources, and national mission is supposed to kind of provision this mission, this vision of resources for sustainability of the platform. I will skip over this and thank you very much. We'll take questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much, participants and panelists.
Thank you, Prabhakar. That was a quick snapshot of all the work that's gone into the CML over the past year or so, and also a good preview, a wonderful preview of all the effort that's gone into this area over the many years. I would ask any clarification questions normally over here. We haven't received any, but when we do, I'll address them at the end of the session during the discussion part. There are a couple that have come in earlier during registration. There are a couple of comments. Krishan Kaushik says this is undoubtedly a first, but to assess and harness the long-term sustainability of the biodiversity conservation profile and human well-being, we must integrate parallelly with the already ongoing programs such as the long-term ecological observations and so on. So that's something that that's come in as a commentary on that. Also, Anil Kumar of MSSRF says that they're willing to share data on rare, endemic, and threatened tree species of the Western Ghats, as well as wild foods and medicinal plants. It's something that you may want to take a note of. With those couple of comments in mind, I'd like to go on to the next speaker. Let me see. Oh, wait, one more question's coming in. No, okay. The next speaker is Dr. Nandini Rajamani. Nandini is an assistant professor of biology at IISER in Tirupati. She studies the behavioral ecology and evolutionary biology of animal populations, often within the context of environmental and habitat change. Her research group works across multiple landscapes in India, including the Trans-Himalayas, with the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats, using a variety of methods, fieldwork, behavioral experiments, molecular methods, and occasionally crowdsourcing data also. Nandini, over to you.
Thank you. Am I audible? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen. All right, thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited and quite happy to be here. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the work we do in my lab, particularly with crowdsourced data. So we study small mammals, and with this particular talk, I'm going to talk to you about palm squirrels and how we have recently begun to look at palm squirrel distributions, not just with traditional data, but also with crowdsourced data. So squirrels are globally present. They have high diversity in certain pockets, certain parts of the world. And India is one of these places. We have about 39 species. That's about 10% of mammal diversity for the country. And this is a map of distributions. This is just the outline. So wherever you see more red means there's more diversity. So in India, you see two hotspots, the Northeast and the Western Ghats, not surprisingly. Squirrels are common. And for a very long time, they've been part of human history as well as mythology. Maybe we've all heard these stories about how squirrels got their stripes and, you know, in exchange for service to the gods. But people across India have been noticing squirrels for over 2,000 years. And we can see evidence of this in the Tamil Sangam poetry about 2,000 years ago. And they say things that are relevant even today. In fact, this is a poem that talks about how squirrels nest in people's houses and how jungle people, people who live in forests, have specific roofs to keep squirrels away. But having said all this, squirrels across India are mostly not well studied. We know very little about species, let alone species in places like the Northeast, which are largely, you know, dense rainforests where species are cryptic and not very easy to see. For this study, we thought we would start by asking people or looking to see what people know about the really common species of squirrels. So we're looking at commonly occurring palm squirrels, and they're endemic to the Indian subcontinent, so to India, Sri Lanka, and some to Pakistan. So we picked this group of 4 species in India. And everyone's probably seen a palm squirrel, everyone in the Indian subcontinent. So there is the 5-striped palm squirrel, which is found in North India, the 3-striped palm squirrel, which is found in the southern peninsula. So if you're in Bangalore, that's probably what you see. The jungle striped palm squirrel, which is more on the west coast, and the dusky striped palm squirrel, which occurs in small pockets. So they look kind of similar, and it's quite easy to confuse them. In my lab, we work on trying to communicate to people how it's possible to tell them apart. The 5-striped and 3-striped should be obvious. One has 5 stripes, 5 white stripes, and the other has 3. So we assumed that, you know, it'd be easy to tell them apart for most people, and we thought we would go out there and see what people are recording about species. So with this talk, I want to talk to you about crowdsourced data in particular, and see if crowdsourced data can extend our knowledge of species occurrence. How accurate is such data from citizen science and social media? So in some sense, I think it's important that we make a distinction. We talk about citizen science portals, and these are, like Prabhakar just described, a specific kind of platform that encourages submission of natural history data, biodiversity data. But people are noticing animals all around them, whether they contribute this data to science or not. Today, we live in a world where this data is out there. It's in, you know, it's on the internet. It's on all these platforms. And this is social media. So do we see records on social media? Is it important for us to look at sources like this? The other thing is, how important is it to curate this data? Can one simply accept all the data that is there and use it for science? Or do we take a step back and curate this data? And what is the difference in what we know from traditional sources of data versus these new sources, which are citizen science and social media? Finally, we use some of this data to run some species distribution models to ask how robust this data can be. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we collected this data. We created 3 bins. We call certain kinds of data traditional data. And this is primary data collected by the lab or field workers who go out into the field and see animals. We use museum records. We assume that people who worked in museums were extremely rigorous with classification, and we can trust these records. We also use publications because we think that is a community that is well educated for the most part, and people who cite that they've seen squirrels in certain places are probably right, especially in the scientific literature. Then we have the citizen science category, which has today a growing number of portals and platforms. And we used only 3 for this set of analyses. So we used our Naturalist, India Biodiversity Portal, and Mammals of India. And then we looked at social media. So we categorize this as different because we think the aim of someone posting data on social media platforms is not to submit a record, but to share something about their personal lives, very often something in their garden or something they are interacting with. So we use Facebook, Instagram, Flickr, and we created an internal WhatsApp group within ICEF group. So our first step was to curate this data, and we removed data with very broad or non-specific locations. We also removed data for which there was no media. And again, we did not do this for traditional data. From sources like 3bit, we did not remove data because we didn't see the museum specimen that we left that in. For everything else, from citizen science sources or social media sources, we had 3 people in the lab look at every image, and we had consensus opinions when things were confusing. So we really worked hard to curate the data set. So is curation important? So we found that we had about 1,400 records from traditional sources for 4 species of squirrels. But with citizen science data, we had about 870 sources. And remember that this is only 3 platforms right now, all fairly small in terms of reach in India in some ways. Not IBP, but iNaturalist is quite big. So after curation of data, so we looked at every record in each of these platforms. We were down to 730 records. And when we looked at social media, we had a huge number, 3 times this amount of data. So we had about 2,700 data points. And after curation, we were left with 2,000 data points. Most of our data came from Instagram, followed by Facebook and Twitter. So how accurate is species identification by people who upload this data? And in the previous slide, I also talked about how we remove data, and we can see that it's kind of similar, that every platform has a lot of data that is not useful, so it's deleted from our database, but citizen science is significantly more accurate than social media. So we had to throw a lot of social media data out. When we looked at species identification, again, we found that citizen science data is more accurate than social media data. And within squirrels, the 5-striped species was the most misidentified, followed by the jungle stripe. And we think that maybe this has to do with terminology. Species of squirrel are called the Indian palm squirrel or the Indian or the common palm squirrel, and that's all 3-striped. But someone in Delhi will look at a squirrel and say, oh, that's the Indian palm squirrel, right? But it's the 5-striped. So there is something to do with terminology here. But all in all, we find that across species, yes, we have misidentifications, definitely more misidentifications on social media. When we look at where this data is spread across India, I'm taking the example of 2 species for which we had a lot of data. This is the 5-striped palm squirrel, the species that's found in the north. So the polygon that you see here is the IUCN map, which is what traditionally describes species occurrence. And we see that, and all of these points are data from the 3 different sources. So we see that traditional data largely conforms to the map that we know for species distribution for the 5-stripe. We look at citizen science data, we see that there's actually very little data. We look at social media data, we see the complete opposite. It's extremely dense. People, for some reason, are photographing squirrels a lot and putting up these images in many, many places. What's also interesting is that we saw records outside of the IUCN distribution. And in my lab, this is of special interest to us because we think species like palm squirrels are adapting or responding very quickly to changes that are happening around them, whether this is urbanization or habitat change. And so for us to see that there are records outside of locations that we normally think of as a species limit or distribution limit, that's exciting. So we saw that this was true for all sources of data. For the 3-striped palm squirrel, the species in the south, Again, we see that citizen science data is the sparsest source of data, and social media is the most dense source of data. So a lot of people are posting photos of squirrels. Again, records outside the IUCN maps are present in all three sources, especially social media down south. I think is a mistake in the map. But traditional data also has a lot of species occurrence points outside of the IUCN map. Now, traditional data points are also museum records that we might or might not have seen firsthand. We have photographs from certain museums, but not from a lot of museums. And so these are points that we need to verify by writing to curators. So what can we do with this kind of data? To our minds, the first question to ask was, is there a kind of bias in how this data is coming in the first place? Is this truly reflecting where squirrels are? Or is it because of where people are? And we see that social media records tend to be from urban areas and close to roads. So yes, there is a bias in records coming in. On the other hand, citizen science data, while also quite urban, does seem to come from record locations that are outside of night-like areas or road network areas, which seems to suggest that maybe more naturalists are contributing data to citizen science forums. So maybe we're getting a slightly more true representation of where species are found. So we took this data, we took all of our raw occurrences, we thinned the data, we took a few climatic predictors, and we ran all of this through Maxent to see if, before we say that we want to restrict ourselves to a certain source of data, do these different sources tell us something different about species? Traditional studies of species modeling or distributions use primary data, or what we call traditional sources of secondary data, which are museums and publication records. Citizen science is now becoming more accepted, but very few studies think to include sources outside of this. So what do we see? We see, we wanted to check if models predict species distribution areas differently based on the data source. So we see that for the 5-striped barn squirrel, none of these models are entirely satisfactory. And that's because this is preliminary analysis, and we have a long way to go before we are done with robust models. But off the top of what we've done so far, we see that citizen science data gives us really robust models, but in terms of prediction of area, our social science predictions are more similar to our IUCN maps. Of course, a combined model gives you the best map when you take into account traditional sources, citizen science, and social media. We also see that factors that come up as important and predictors of squirrels seem to be slightly different across different sources, though this is not extremely different. So for the 5-striped barn squirrel, we see that seasonality of rainfall and total amount of absolute rainfall seem to be important. This is a species that seems to like to live in drier parts of the country. For the full model with all sources of data is the best model. But we see that social media sources here perform better than any other model. And it also gives us a better model in terms of recovering areas. So what do we think from this work? We think that citizen science data, but especially social media records, really have the potential to extend knowledge of species occurrence. However, most people who upload photos or post photos or share photos have no idea what they are sharing. And curation is a massive task by itself. And curating thousands of images just for 3 species, the 4th species is rarely seen, has taken us months. So, but without this curation, we would have gotten a lot of possibly false data points. More observations are required from locations with insufficient records, and we think social media can fill this gap. So if you look at the 3 maps below, this is a combination of points for all 4 species of squirrels. The map on the left is traditional sources, and then you have citizen science and social media. The map really gets much denser as you go from left to right. And it's true for all 4 species of squirrels. So in the end, we think that it's really important for us to start looking at combinations of data sources, traditional sources, citizen science, but also social media. And I will stop here, and I'm happy to take questions. But things that we're doing in the lab, we are addressing, we're working on social media platforms to try and maybe route people or send people back to citizen science platforms. In the future, this is possibly the only sustainable way to collect data. We're starting with a few initiatives online. We have a survey that's going out across several platforms, and we'll try and post a link on the Biodiversity Collaborative Facebook page to ask people what they know about their squirrels. So far, all of our engagement with people has been one-on-one in the form of comments on social media or citizen science platforms. And we think that it might be, the next step might be to provide information for them that helps them figure some of this out on their own. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Nandini. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm sure there's a lot more to add there, because you are reflecting on with a very specific example on how actually data can be converted into information, and how the source of the data really matters, and with the way in which data from the modern techniques of citizen science and social media, how they need to be incorporated in one way, shape, or form to enable us to convert data into information. So thank you for that. We'll get back with more questions later on. I'd like to proceed quickly to Dr. John Pickering. John is the president of the Polistes Foundation. He co-founded the All-Taxa Biodiversity Inventory of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and also the wonderful Discover Life website, which is www.discoverlife.org. His current focus is on managing the Shoal Creek Sanctuary for nature and its surroundings residents, and on building the shield, which is what's referred to as species, health, and interactions of ecosystems linked to drivers, to tackle some of the grand challenges in biodiversity science and environmental management. A challenging task indeed. John, thank you for being up so early in the morning. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much. I'm honored to join you, and it's a thrill, a delight. I'm going to not specifically talk so much about data management. I've certainly got experience in that field, but take it into, so to speak, into the clouds, and try to get a higher level of where I'm hoping biodiversity research and management and so on goes across this planet. You know, I must compliment the Indian government for putting as many resources, and your enthusiasm for biodiversity research in India is fabulous. I mean, I'm working on this project Shield, and our goal is much more modest. But ultimately, if the U.S., which has a gross domestic project about 10 times that of India's, if we were to do the same thing, it would be about $1 billion a year. And you can sort of say, oh, that sounds like so much money that you would be putting into it. But when you realize, because of Corona, we've just put 15% of our GDP, $3 trillion, into trying to recover from this. Whereas if we put that small amount in trying to figure out where are the bats, where are the viruses, and so on, we would be able to argue this from a neoliberal, let's not worry about conservation for the sake of conservation, but we're worried about it from the economic aspects and the public health aspects and so on. So I must compliment you guys for taking a lead in this. I'm hoping you're going to embarrass the US government to follow you. So thank you very much. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is talk about a challenge that I was at a meeting with Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, and he just sort of said the next thing we really got to push for is to understand ecosystems and the relationship with biodiversity. And so what I'm going to try to do today is, through my experience over the last 30 years working in biodiversity, is talk about 4 projects. I'm actually not going to talk about my most recent joy, which is running a sanctuary, a nature sanctuary. But I'm going to talk about these 4 projects that I've been involved with and what I've learned for them. And I hope that it will give you some advice or a counsel of where I would, if I had the resources and the energy and the human population that you guys have got, where I would take biodiversity in India. And I'm hoping you guys are going to tell us how to do it back in the United States and the rest of the world. So let me just briefly describe these 4 projects to you, and then I will come up with a and if you can let me know, I forgot to put my timer on, so I don't know how many more minutes I've got left, and I don't want to go over time. So if you can, just wave me by or something. When you want, give me 30 seconds to wrap up at the end. Okay. So back in 1997, I started a project in the Great Smoky Mountains called the ATBI, the All Taxa Biodiversity of the Smokies. And this was a couple hundred PhD scientists, 2,000 citizens that came in and helped. And at the time they knew about 9,000, nearly 10,000 species in the park. They've gone forward, they've now got 21,000 species in that park. But it's only one park, and it's just, for the most part, a list of species for that park. And this is in the eastern United States. I'll come back to the lessons from that in a minute. The second thing is, as part of that, I built a website called Discover Life. And Discover Life in America was the Smokies Project, the name of the organization we set up for that. But Discover Life was the website that would support this. And during the course of the next 20 years, we've had 5 billion hits on the website. We've now got 1.4 million species names that we've assembled. We've got 800,000 maps. There's 20 terabytes of data behind it. And, I focused on moths. We've got the World Bee Checklist of nearly 21,000 bees that are documented around the world, and it's well cited and so on. So there's this Discover Life aspect. I'm going to come back and tell you why each of these not have failed, but what we need to do to get to the next step in a minute. The third project, which wasn't mentioned, is I decided that we really need to work at study sites and focus on really, really detailed data. And so we started a moth project where we photograph moths at the lights in the morning. So this morning I got 40 moths before joining you. So I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and take photographs of moths. And basically, we've now got 1,373 species of moths at my house. It's a phenomenal diversity. I got 900,000 photographs across 25 sites from Costa Rica through Canada. And basically we've got that, and we collect these data nightly. So at my house, I've now got 3,800 nightly samples. I've identified over 250,000 moths and so on. And that fine-grained data tells us something that you won't get if you're just going out like the museum collectors did, and an ornithologist goes to one site and someone studying squirrels goes to another one, and the citizen scientists go all over the place and so on, and the botanists. And we can't assemble communities from most data, and it's very important that we do. The third one is this concept of SHIELD. I'm working, the Plistes Foundation is a think tank based in Boston. We've got, a board of directors that's pushing 40 people, which sounds a lot, but the idea is what we're trying to do is design what the US should be doing in biodiversity for and then beyond that to the world, what we should be doing, what are the issues and so on. And I think the main thing that you should be asking yourself is, what are these data going to do and why do we want them? So if the data are going to help the managers on the ground, whether it's controlling invasive species or stopping the next plague coming along, what are those data going to do? The second one is for the policymakers. That's critical. And the third view is for the scientists. So let me just give you a few highlights of these studies. So I'll go back to the ATBI study and the 2,000 species. What did we learn from 21,000? I mean, when we did this, we thought it would be 90,000 to 100,000 species in the park, but you know, we're getting there. First off, there are a lot of species, and people need to study them together and get their interactions and so on, which, you know, so we've got, you know, 3,400 species. There's 21,000 species, 1,000 of those were new to science, 3,481 fungi. The beetles are up there with 2,600. The plants are at 2,400. The Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths and skippers, are at 1,900, and the flies are at 2,100. If you take those groups, you can basically say 50% of the species are in those 5 groups. The mammals, they're down there at 400. I mean, the vertebrates are at 479. And if you were to say how important in terms of the overall biodiversity of mammals, well, guess what? The fungi outnumber the mammals by a factor of 50. So I would argue that you should be starting to understand this vast diversity of biodiversity. And if I scale up what we've got in the Smokies to what I think you should have in India, you're looking somewhere between 300 and 500,000 species. This is before you start divvying up, like the Craycroft is dividing birds into 2. So instead of having 9,000 birds around the planet, the American Museum's now saying, oh, there's probably 18,000. But before you do that, I think you probably get up to 100 species you need to be considering. And I want to see you guys studying as many of those as possible, not necessarily all the species, but, you know, go for as many as you can. That's step 1. Okay, don't just focus on a particular group like birds or like vascular plants. Okay, so what did I learn from the moth project? And that is absolutely the importance of detailed data. So you can get the phenology, the daily phenology, when going on. 2 things have come out of this that you probably don't know. One is there is probably a pupal bank, like a seed bank in plants, in insects, such that these pupae are going, and we've actually looked at this using radioactive isotopes. These pupae, the moth pupae, are going into the ground and can be coming out 15, 20 years later. So there is this a bank that, so when you're looking at insect populations and the flight of insects, it's a decade or multi-year process which we don't understand. The second thing is something that came up recently. I'm rearing, you know, caterpillars to put into, you know, see how long they take to come out. And I had a horror. I mean, that all these things are coming out a month after they should in the fall. And that was because I put them on my deck and I had light pollution on my deck, which was interfering with the diapause, the winter diapause. And these things were coming out late in the fall to the point where they would die because there wouldn't be any food for them. So light pollution is incredibly important in this. We don't realize that. You've got all these pesticides going in there and so on. So you want to get detailed data at sites, long-term monitoring. We've now got these for, this is the 11th year of nearly, you know, nightly data, and then across sites and so on. Okay, so
another minute, John, maybe?
Another minute?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I want to now talk about SHIELD and what we're trying to do with SHIELD. And the first thing is you want to focus on individual sites. You want to get the botanists, the entomologists, the mammalogists, everybody to focus on particular sites. And if you had 1,000 sites, multiple sites where you focus, you can then look at the interactions in those sites. You can look at the drivers of the biodiversity, the numbers and so on, and you can start understanding ecosystems. So you want to do focus on a site. I think you should do at least 1,000 sites in India so you can get natural experiments. Technology, the last thing I'm going to say is technology is going to come along and help you. You're clearly knowing what you're doing in terms of the data models and so on. We've got the capacity in the clouds now to do data management, but what are the data available? We're building with the Smithsonian a library, a genetic DNA library for the North American species. You guys should be going out there getting that, because then you can use traps to just say, okay, these 500 species are in a trap when you couldn't identify them as humans. Finally, you can start looking, using image processing, visual, computer vision to start going out there and identifying these things. So piecing this together, the main thing I'm trying to argue is try to get all your people working at a particular set of sites. So if you've got citizen scientists out there saying, hey, listen, we're all going down to the park. So the people that are interested in the mushrooms and the plants and the insects and the mammals and stuff all work together, and that data comes together. Do it frequently, and then you're going to have these long-term monitoring sites. Thank you very much. I mean, I'm happy to help, give you, advice or put you in connections with people and so on. I'm delighted to be part of this growing team that you've got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate that very much. The experience of dealing with biodiversity at scale is something that really has come out from the learnings that you've mentioned here. I'm sure we'll reflect on that as we go along and take this ambitious initiative to the level and to the scale that it needs to be taken. And some of those learnings about working together in some specific sites, but over a long term and so on, are things that we definitely need to take into account. Thank you for that again. Last but not the least, my good friend, Dr. Vijay Chandru. Vijay is the adjunct faculty at the Biosystems Science and Engineering group at the Indian Institute of Science. He's also the founder and director of MetaString Foundation and the Biodiversity Collaborative. He's a national distinguished technologist from the Indian Institute of Science working on the area of digital health. His work with nonprofits in the recent years has been dedicated to health policy, open data, and healthcare access to underserved communities. Extremely relevant today, of course, in the world that we're living in. So with that, over to you, Vijay.
Thank you, Nitin. Certainly delighted to be here in this August company to speak about a few things related to open data and data science and so on that affects all of us. I do want to remind everyone that I guess we have this national mission for biodiversity and human well-being, and so in some sense, I think my interests are sort of in the and human well-being part of it, and in some ways we all complement each other, of course. And so let me just open up the little deck. I'll try to be quick here. I think I sort of imported Prabhakar's slide that he had to gloss over. And so this was his report card slide, and I'll talk a little bit about the health heat map in our discussion now. But these are just cues for you. Maybe during the discussion, question and answer, we can get into some of these other aspects of medicinal plants, etc. Basically, I think the idea of open data, and we heard about citizen science and social media, and I think with 1 billion citizens and affordable data connectivity, we are certainly going to see a lot of consumption as well as production of digital data, and I think the challenge will be, of course, as John just pointed out, to be able to build this at scale to be of the quality that's required for science and for policy, so I think as far as Medestring Foundation is concerned, it's really to be a trustee of some of this open data and to build the right technology platforms and solutions so we can extract value. And I think John alluded to this with his idea of using computer vision and machine learning and so on to put this together. So Medestring has done many things. The founders of Medestring have always been involved with open data and open source. We were the guys who came up with the Simputer 20 years ago, and so that has been sort of a driving philosophy in a lot of things that we have done. Of course, you heard about the biodiversity, the India Biodiversity Portal. We're also now stepping into healthcare, and some of it is very relevant to the mission. So that's what I'll focus on. And this health heat map is where the overlap comes in, because essentially, I think if we really want to look at One Health and what that means and how we integrate both biodiversity and sort of the health infrastructure of the country, the challenges and existing health challenges in the country, I do believe that something like this platform will be required. We are in the early stages, as Prabhakar mentioned in a slide. This is a beta version that's up on the web, but do take it for a spin. And we've also just published an article that describes how some of the One Health aspects comes in. The authors Abhi Vanak and Uma Ramakrishnan, who have been focused on One Health, have contributed some of their insights and data that have gone into the health heat map. I think an important aspect of technology that we're all going to have to address is how when we, I call it wrangling and ingesting data, right? Because when you go out and get open data, as was pointed out, I think the curation is a big challenge, and there's also often aspects of extraction of data, because sometimes it's in documents, in PDFs and so on, and how you pull that data out, how you transform it, and then eventually how you load it. And again, there's lots of technology today that can help in this and streamline pipelines and automate and provide lots of productivity tools to make this a reality of pulling together open data and making it and democratizing it, making it available and accessible, right? So the guiding philosophy is to allow unrestricted access to complete data, In some cases, you may be quite happy with metadata. In some cases, you may want very raw and fine-grained data with a lot of detail. There is sometimes a challenge of data security, and so we do have to think about how to create data lakes and enable research to happen closer to the data rather than moving the data around. And I think that's a nice engineering challenge that has already been addressed elsewhere, and we can certainly adopt some of that. And I just want to end on the note that we do require a change in culture in the country. That I think we do. The government has, and I think policymakers have actually thought carefully about how we could be creating much more value by data sharing and accessibility. And in fact, laws have been passed almost 7-8 years ago on the National Data Sharing and Accessibility Policy, which in a sense says that any data that is generated from public funding really ought to come back to being a public good. And it would, I think, behoove all of us as scientists to think about how we can contribute to this goal of democratizing data so that every individual can have appropriate access to information without necessarily having to go through a legal process of right to information, etc. That's exactly what this National Data Sharing and Accessibility Policy says. And I think, as India is starting to really strategize around this notion of self-reliance or Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, I do think we need to pay a lot of attention to how we make open data a reality and at scale and with all the right technology and tools. And I think hopefully this national mission and the cataloging and mapping or project will help us take some important steps in that direction. So with that, I'll stop here and I'll leave it open for discussion. Right.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you for a quick overview of the very ambitious program in front of you there. I think you said it in a few words, but there's a lot underneath that, and given time, I know you've just covered just the surface of what MetaString and you all are doing, especially in terms of not only providing the tools such as the extraction tool and so on for curation and data lakes and other such technologies, but also showing that we do share a common objective, especially with the government, where there is an attempt there to try and integrate this data and to make it feasible to go towards applications and for the use of the data. With that, we have a little bit of time, just a little bit remaining for a quick set of questions. The coordinating team has sent across a few questions grouped together. But one of them that speaks to the discussion that's been going on here is about adding more data. We asked one in response to Nandini's presentation earlier, but more about how can the large data sets that we expect from Earth observation data and satellite imagery be of use, and how can that be potentially integrated, especially when you look at technologies like cloud computing and others that are now quite easily accessible to us. So let me first throw that open, start maybe with Prabhakar, and then maybe Vijay. Just a couple of minutes if we can spend on that. I have two more questions to go with.
Yeah, so Earth observations data about 5-7 years ago came out into the public domain in a major way. And there are big platforms like the Google Earth Engine, like our own Bhuvan, like the Amazon platforms have made this available for people to use and exploit and do whatever they want. Out of these Earth observation data that's been coming out, and these are petabytes of data, there are data products that have come out. For example, there is a very open data product, which is the surface water distribution across so many years. And all the surface water has been mapped very, very nicely with these satellite images and produced real time. We know, of course, fires, for example, the occurrence of fires today is open data that's available. So all this, there are data products that are coming out. And in fact, there are platforms that come out which open out this open data for public use. For example, the Resource Watch of World Resources Institute, or the FAO projects on, or the UNTP projects on environmental life. And we'll see much more of this big Earth observation satellite data being converted into data products and brought out. I think it's very, very important for biodiversity to use and integrate such data with their platforms, with locally developed data integrated with globally sourced, global Earth observation satellite data.
I think Prabhakar has said what's needed to be said, so we can move on to the next question.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And thank you, Sukanya Randhava, for that question. Another question that's come in from Vivek Girija is there a need, and maybe Chandru, you can pick up this one since we were on this, is there a need for data regulation, like data access and benefit sharing, or some MOU with third-party platforms like Plantair, eBird, and iNaturalist, and so on? How does one think about this as we start integrating these data sets? Yeah.
Well, of course, the whole issue of data and its value and its integration and various aspects of data protection are very much in the purview of policy today and of legal frameworks. And I think India has its share. We have something between a GDPR and a more relaxed system. I think we have very recently a new policy on non-personal data, which has just come out, which kind of tries to carve out space outside the Data Protection Act, which was really a response to privacy as being declared as a fundamental right by our Supreme Court. So it's a complicated space, and I think the legal minds are working at trying to map how to work with this space. And so MOUs with third parties, all of this will have to be structured, keeping all of this regulation and legal structure that is coming about. Fortunately, many of our young legal minds have become very active in this space. And I think we can look to a lot of advice going forward. And
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I knew that we needed a lawyer on this panel here somewhere. But be that as it may, a question from Mayur Nandikar that came by email also speaks about integrating other data sets, which we've addressed, and also from Kajal Barman about the use of cloud computing and so on. Another question that's come in that's quite interesting is about the long-term ecological observatories that are set up by the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change. And these are the long-term observations, the kinds that I suspect John was talking about earlier, and how in fact they might be useful. So let me pose that question first to Nandini. How can such data, actually the long-term data, be utilized in specific applications of data to convert what is a repository of data, which is in the CML, to information that would be useful to the end users? And how do you see that integration with efforts like the long-term observatory to be useful to you?
Well, I would say that it's invaluable. Long-term ecological observatories are a source of not just data, but also an understanding of how an entire system changes over time. That we can piece together with data from other sources, but it's something that I think India sorely lacks. We have just kind of initiated several LTEOs across India. And hopefully in 10 years' time, our understanding of critical landscapes will be very different from what it is today.
Thank you. I think that that answer to Krishan Kaushik's question actually leads me to ask John in terms of, I know you made a few comments about the need for long-term funding for biodiversity information as it exists in India. And the numbers you quoted are actually huge as compared to what we have in India. And what you're saying is we actually may need a lot more. Can you reflect on this in terms of the kind of effort that we might need to see when we look at bringing people together, and the lessons that you reflected on, like working on a common site together with multiple people and so on. Can you reflect on some of this experience that you've gathered from large data sets in the US?
Yes, okay, and I want to relate it back to the satellites as well. I mean, in North America or in the US, we've got about 30, nearly 40,000 what we call natural areas. This includes 500 national parks and so on, state parks, county parks, and so on. We've got the LTER network, we've got NEON, the National Ecological Observation Network, and so on. We've got all these sites. And we've got an LTER network as well, as you do. But a lot of these places don't do the same thing with each other. So our LTER network, I mean, they just were interested about insect decline. And there's somebody with a sweet net in Kansas getting grasshoppers, and there's someone in Ohio with a suction trap pulling out aphids of the air. And they're not doing the same thing across these sites. And I would argue that it's really critical. If you could send your citizen scientists and saying, we've got these protocols, we'd like your help. Here are the sites we want you to do it. We don't want somebody in their backyard and someone else going along a roadside and so on. We want to concentrate these things at the same places. So relating to the satellites, there's Leslie Reese at Georgetown University has a National Science Foundation grant to look at the asynchrony between birds and their nesting success with the prey available. So whether they're moths or caterpillars and so on. And what they're doing is they're looking at data from the satellites, which tells you the greening effect. We've got these MODIS satellites that would tell you when the spring's coming, when the vegetation's going. Then they take my moth data along the East Coast, and they get caterpillar data, and then they go to eBird, and they get the bird data, and then they integrate that with the temperature data that the satellites are collecting as well. And you've got this integration of data, and then you can say, oh, the birds are starving to death because they're too early or they're too late or whatever, or this is a boom year and they're doing well. So you can look at the nesting success of the birds. We've lost, the Cornell lab estimates something like 3 billion birds have disappeared from the North American continent. What's going wrong? Is it because climate change is affecting when they're migrating and they're often not in synchrony with their insects? So I would just say, really focus on working together. Choose your sites. Each county or each parish or each village or each town could say, these are the 2 or 3 sites we want everybody to go to, and then get the data from there and integrate it into your systems, share it, get the satellites in there, get the weather data in there, piece it all together, and you can actually get things which will be useful for the land managers, for the scientists, for the policymakers, for the public health people. Everything should be pulled together. If you're doing it as, one study's doing this somewhere and somebody else is doing something else in a completely different place, you may understand the bird distributions of India, but if you don't know where the caterpillars are and the moths are, your birds are going to have a hard time. And this is the thing, it's about the integration, and it's about, you've got the data systems, you've got the cloud, you've got the computing power, What you need are the human interactions, whether it's pulling in the lawyers to say, okay, guys, you got to go here and this is how we work. Get everybody working on literally the same platform with the same ways of doing this. And if someone has got, you know, is a specialist in fairy shrimp, get them plugged in somewhere, and then they can start looking at it. And through the molecular sequences, we can sample an incredible amount of species at sites now. Incredible.
Thank you. And that integration piece actually answers the question from Regan about, you know, by working together like this, can we actually come up with potentially a framework that one can follow in such integration, so that we can go from extracting information from data, but even more so extracting meaning from that information. And that takes us to that one step further. And Dr. Anil Kumar also has a comment here about integrating our capacity building efforts along with that, so that when we are actually going out to a site and bringing multiple people together, then how can we create that common understanding, taxonomic understanding, and so that we can understand the systems a lot better than what we've been able to do. There are many other questions out there. There are some on email. I think we are getting a little past time. So at this point in time, unless any one of the speakers has, or panelists has something to add at the last moment, I would like to thank all the panelists and the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, which has made this possible. And thank you everyone for attending the seminars. Last call for any of the panelists. Anything?
Just want to thank you all, and someday I hope to meet you all in person in India again.
Absolutely,
Fabulous
John.
food.
Oh, that too. That too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Nitin, I just
Webinars.
wanted to raise a quick point. I was just reading the Lancet issue on burden of health, and from a long-term perspective, I think, of course, so the challenge of the burden of health in the Anthropocene, you know, they raise two factors. One is, of course, climate change, which we all know. But the other is migration and human migration, and following how working age populations are going to move, and how that is going to have a very long-term effect on burden of health, as well as on wealth and equity. So I do think we need to bring that dimension of human migration as well into these perspectives, in addition to biodiversity. So.
Absolutely, the human well-being component being
Right.
such a critical part of this, indeed. With regard to that, the next webinar in this series is Biodiversity Capacity Building and Outreach, especially regarding educating, engaging, and informing the public on biodiversity. That's on Friday, the 23rd of October, at again 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Indian Standard Time. I'm sure you'll get more information from the Biodiversity Collaborative on this, and as we go along towards the end of this week. Again, thank you to the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor. We look forward to joining you again on Friday, the 23rd. Thank you again, and good day to all of you.